Hello everyone. Welcome again to this interview about Chapter 12, Distrust, Accountability and Capacity in South Africa's Fragmented Education System. The chapter was written by Nomankocho Pakade and Tokazani Chilenga Butao. Can I ask you to briefly introduce the chapter first?
Well, thank you, Melanie. The chapter highlights the challenges in accountability and capacity in policy implementation within the provincial education departments, more specifically in the province of the Eastern Cape, against the historical inequalities within the education system. We use the school rationalization project to illustrate the interplay between accountability and capacity in policy implementation and the reproduction of distrust. Rationalization is a national policy which aims to provide more efficient and effective schooling through the closure of small and non-viable schools and the reallocation of learners to larger, better resource schools. More specifically, the school rationalization project was set up through the Government Technical Advisory Center between 2016 and 2019 to assist the Eastern Cape Department of Education towards institutionalizing 10-year district plans of rationalization. What underpins the school rationalization project are three legislative processes guided by the South African Schools Act of 1996, more specifically Section 12A and Section 33, which gives a sense with regards to guiding the process of the closure, the merger, and the realignment of schools. The ultimate objective of rationalization is to improve teaching and learning. And so through this case study, we argue that there are formal bureaucratic processes that enable accountability, and these are expressed through law and regulations. While on the other hand, there are practices, uncodified practices within there are uncodified practices within microsystems of governance at the provincial and at the district level. And at times, these then produce different outcomes to the intended goals of improving learning and teaching.
Yeah, it's quite interesting in the chapter when you talk about how the rationalization project didn't have those intended outcomes. When schools weren't actually closed or didn't merge, and you talk about why that project didn't work because of the kind of non-qualified practices that prevent the kind of formal regulation to have its intended effects. Can you talk a little bit more about why the project failed and why practitioners on the ground didn't support these policies and kind of created their or used their own set of informal rules and processes which counterbalanced the kind of intended outcomes of this project?
Well, there are many layers of accountability in the South African education system, but then these layers of accountability are accompanied by different capacities that manifest through codified and uncodified practices. And then the reforms have been stifled also by a number of factors that impact on the very accountability and capacity within the system. Let me unpack that a bit. So for example, the many announcement rounds of rationalization have limited its legitimacy in the public more generally in terms of education stakeholders externally, but also within internal processes in terms of the different levels of bureaucrats. Let's look at it more specifically again within the period of 2012 and 2015 in the Education Department of the Eastern Cape, where they initially attempted to rationalize schools. Key to the challenges that were highlighted in this phase is that scholar transport, the provision of scholar transport was quite a challenge with regards to ensuring that process was run smoothly and that it was completed. Second to that is the issue of infrastructure backlog with regards to your learner, class ratio, and so forth. And so there's a sense then of practices in the system that speak to an incomplete implementation, as I've mentioned earlier on, the South African Schools Act Section 33 and 12A processes. And this is also due to factors such as lack of information about the codified practices that already exist. And so the result then of non-compliance is what we call in the chapter white elephant schools. And these essentially are vacant schools, non-operational if you like. Literally the school exists as a building. There are no warm bodies in it. And these schools then are registered within the education system. Because of non-compliance, they haven't been deregistered. But the one thing that happens then at the provincial level is such that they freeze the allocation, they suspend the allocation of resources to these schools, and they become categorized as pending closure. So we have these pending closure schools under the category of white elephants. And then the second consequent of non-compliance is the notion of double packing, and this refers to the excess supply of teachers in what we refer to as the receiving schools, where the teachers follow the learners. And so these are administrative bubbles, if you like, that are a consequence of non-compliance, but also reveal at least the attempt of uncodified practices, that is, officials resort to using uncodified practices more than codified practices in order to implement education policy, as evidenced in the rationalization study. What does this tell us? Is that the recommendation to rationalize and realign the education landscape in the province is underpinned by the need to adhere to national standards and norms in terms of infrastructure, resource allocation, in relation to learners, etc. And this then has implications for the effective and responsive distribution of resources within the education system.
Yeah, so essentially there is an intention to coordinate capacity across the system in a more efficient manner by closing and merging schools that are not viable. And then that's apparently not working because practitioners on the ground are not adhering to the kind of formal rules and legislation around how many numbers of students you need to have for one school, how many teachers, etc. So why is there such a lack of buy-in for this particular rationalization project then? Why are practitioners opposing this specific legislation?
That's an interesting question, but it's a bit complex. It's not so much about buy-in. As we all know, buy-in is somewhat negotiated, but let's appreciate the phrasings that we're trying to use within the chapter. So the notion of codified and uncodified practices enables a closer reading of the interplay in accountability and capacity. So what do we mean by codified practices? Here we refer to your formal guidelines, clear rules within the system that speaks to policy implementation, whereas uncodified practices are the informal processes that officials undertake to implement the very same formal policy. And so our paper demonstrates that school district officials choose, or rather create, these informal rules and processes to implement complex policies of school rationalization. And in the analysis in the chapter, we demonstrate that standardization as a process of hierarchical coordination is difficult to achieve because it is complex with competing procedures and resource-intensive demands. What do I mean by this? So if we go back again to this era of 2012 and 2015 within the Department of Education in the Eastern Cape, what we've learned is that there are two practices that have emerged due to these uncodified practices. The one practice, which we refer to as practice A at the national level, is this notion of pending schools that I have outlined earlier on, where the system registers the schools. They haven't been deregistered because all the procedural steps that are outlined have not been followed through. And so they exist insofar as the education landscape within the information management system, but they're not operational. Practice B then speaks to the practice at the district level, through which district officials and circuit managers concede to demands from principals, your school governing body, and the communities, and say, indeed, these are small, non-viable schools. The quality of teaching is affected by multi-grade teaching and so forth. And so literally, the district officials then facilitate the move of learners, followed by teachers to other receiving schools. And we refer to this as operational power in terms of the district officials. But what then this does creates an administrative bubble where while rationalization is being followed through, but it's followed through in a non-compliant manner. So we have then these innovative, well-intentioned ways of navigating the administrative processes for rationalization on the ground. Sometimes they adversely contribute to instability in the system. And so similar to practice A then, the school remains registered with less numbers as compared to practice A where the school is vacant. But ultimately these two practices, they feed into each other and create two non-compliant parallel practices of closure in these two levels of the department, and ultimately they do not lead to the deregistration of schools. So you find that we have X amount of schools within the system, but they're not resourced, and we're not certain at times if indeed there are schools that have the learners. So theoretically we can talk of practice A and B, but in practice it is difficult to track the numbers that fluctuate between B, that move from B to A, for example.
So in the chapter, you also talk about, or you explain the kind of failure of the rationalization project by looking at the apartheid legacy of South Africa and how this has created a context of mistrust or trust deficit. Can you explain what that trust deficit looks like? For example, who doesn't trust whom and in what particular area, and how does that explain the failure of closing schools?
The distrust in South Africa's education system was originally produced by the Bantu education system during apartheid. Within this system, schools were built and resourced mainly in white and urban areas and were either not well resourced or not built at all in the homelands and Bantustans. This created distrust between parents and learners because they couldn't trust the government to provide access to education or quality education. This distrust was further compounded by the lack of choice over language and subjects at schools. The particular legacy of distrust in schools that we refer to, can I do that part again? Mm-hmm. The particular legacy of distrust in schools that were under-resourced has continued into democratic South Africa because the current Department of Basic Education has struggled to address inequality in education, especially where infrastructure is concerned. This is why the rationalization project is an important policy area to investigate in South Africa's education system, because the rationalization project effectively tries to address an infrastructural problem in the education system. However, the policy is hindered by the complexities of the implementation of the policy process. This perpetuates the cycle of distrust produced during apartheid because parents, learners, and the wider school community continue to wait for better schools, and the reasons for the delay are not clear. Our chapter illustrates some of these reasons in light of distrust, capacity, and accountability in South Africa's education system.
Yeah, so I assume that the trust deficit also has consequences for wider education reform and how that trust deficit impacts on other types of reforms as well, and how the department is able to implement those. Can you speak a little bit to that as well?
The trust deficit in South Africa's education system slows down education reform because it is difficult for officials to navigate a complex policy process. And as our chapter demonstrates, this produces distrust within the system as officials and education institutions struggle to implement rationalization. This, however, doesn't mean that officials and education institutions should be let off the hook. It does mean, however, that there needs to be a more systematic effort at education reform outside of laws and regulations and government interventions.
Sure. So that really also begs the question of how can that trust deficit be repaired to make reform programs such as the rationalization project successful in the future, given that trust seems to be such an important condition to for South Africa's education system to move forward. How can that deficit be repaired?
The trust deficit can be repaired in two main ways. Firstly, the education system in South Africa needs to address issues such as rationalization strategically. Given the intervention that government undertook in the Eastern Cape, as demonstrated in our chapter, government has access to information regarding what is working in the policy process and what isn't working. Therefore, there's ample opportunity for government to review the rationalization process and improve upon it. Secondly, the levels of accountability need to be clarified within provincial education departments. As demonstrated in our chapter, there are many stakeholders in the policy process, each with their own tasks and understanding of how to implement schools rationalization. This might look efficient on paper, but it actually produces inefficiencies in practice because the different levels of implementation and subsequent accountability lead to confusion and uncodified practices. Clarifying the levels of accountability during the rationalization implementation process will increase trust within the system as well as eradicate uncodified practices.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And it kind of speaks to our overarching framework about how trust, accountability, and capacity are really interlinked, and how we need to think about how these three variables interact to allow systems to change and move forwards almost. So thank you again for your interesting reflections and chapter, which presents a really interesting case, particularly given the trust deficit that you encounter in South Africa and your reflections on how to kind of repair that and move to a more effective system. So to our viewers, I hope you're encouraged to read chapter 12. It's a really interesting piece of work that offers very interesting reflections on distrust, particularly in relation to accountability and capacity. And thank you both again for your contribution. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.